And whenever Alex O'Connor does anything, I like to try to respond to it, just simply because I believe he's one of the most high-profile skeptics of our time. And it gives us a good opportunity to hear kind of what the other side is saying and what a good Christian response might sound like. So here's kind of a quasi-good Christian response to the problem of suffering and whether or not it disproves whether God exists, or at least the God of the Bible exists. If a God of love exists, then how comes suffering? All that to say, here's Alex O'Connor jumping into the ring and debating one guy who has a pretty decent argument.
If God exists and wants to come to know everybody and wants to love everybody and does so for the sake of human beings, why he chose to imbue the world with so much suffering that is at least seemingly completely inexplicable?
Are you a father?
No.
I'm a father. I want my son to become just like I am, better than I am, I should say. I want him to become the best that he can be. Is it possible for him to reach his potential without suffering in his life?
Perhaps not, but there's
so suffering is necessary.
Now, I love this analogy because I'm a dad. And it is true, 100%. I know it's true of me as a dad, and it's probably true of every single dad if you're a good dad, that you allow your son to experience intentional difficulty to make him better. And if you believe in God, it's not hard to see how an infinite God with an infinite amount of love, with infinite wisdom, might also allow intentional suffering into an individual's life for the purposes of the greater good. But it seems to be that Alex's response to that is, well, I can't see the greater good, therefore there must not be a greater good. But that's ridiculous. I mean, even if we don't posit an infinite, all-loving God, like there's lots of things that I don't understand. For instance, I was making breakfast this morning, and for the life of me, I do not understand why people, and in fact, they may not even be people, it might come from some level of hell, some demon somewhere concocted these packages of bacon where you have to kind of separate these little thin plastic, films to kind of open the package. Inevitably, your hands are always wet and your fingers just slip between the things, and you can put like 10,000 pounds of force between these two like plastic films and still not separate that bacon package. It's the most confounding thing in the world. Even the most sanctified man might slip trying to open up bacon in the morning for his kids. So inevitably you have to grab a knife and kind of cut into that thing like you're a barbarian and then rip the bacon out and throw it on the pan to actually cook it. I don't understand why anybody in their right mind would package bacon such a way. But also, this may be one other thing, I also don't understand women really. I will be using something like I was this morning. Again, breakfast analogies, using a spatula to try to make breakfast. I set it down, walk away, and within 2 minutes, maybe a minute, I come back and that spatula is gone. And then I knew that culprit, my wife, had struck again. So I went over to the dishwasher and I was like, I bet you it's in here. And I grabbed my spatula so that I can go back to cooking breakfast. I don't know why she moves everything. I don't know why, but she does. Every time I set something down, within 3 seconds, it's gone. All that to say, there's plenty of things I don't understand, but it doesn't mean that they are not true. And I know one of the things that Alex doesn't understand is he doesn't understand free will, because he's already gone on record saying that he's kind of a determinist. He doesn't believe that free will exists. We're just a bunch of automaton robots. But the problem with that is that once you posit an all-knowing, all-loving God that gives human beings free will, and you posit the God of the Bible, well, you start to understand that human beings aren't necessarily just sitting back, being the subjects of God's kind of wicked experiment. And he's just like, take this suffering so that I can do great things with it. That it isn't always that, but that God is a God that gives man free will. And often much of the suffering that we experience here on this earth isn't God just allowing it, but it's us purposefully creating that suffering. I mean, you'd be hard-pressed, actually, to find for me kind of suffering and difficulty that isn't anthropogenic, as they like to say today, that isn't man-made. In fact, you can even talk about, the climate, because the leftists today want to tell us all the time about how the climate has been fabricated by humans, that we're experiencing things that were created by mankind. So even if these quote-unquote acts of God are actually just creations of mankind, I really kind of struggle to parse the difference between things that we didn't create. Maybe you even think about the kid with cancer. Well, maybe those carcinogens that are in the atmosphere were things we created that gave cancer to that kid. So the real question is why does God allow free will? And the answer to that question is very simple. Because yes, free will creates evil, but it's the only way also to create the greatest good. Because you cannot have love without free will. So yeah, free will often is allowed because we are free will agents and God doesn't want to violate his own nature, which is to promise that he wants free will human beings to exist. And because he can't violate his own nature, he allows us to exist. But he allows that to happen again because love is the greatest good and love can only come from free will agents. So that's why a lot of the suffering takes place. A lot of the guys who spoke with Alex didn't really engage in that kind of conversation. They just said, well, what if God could use it for good? But it sounds like God's playing a game with us with suffering. But God is just so good that he uses suffering that is largely brought upon ourselves by ourselves. So it doesn't follow that then God would just create a world where suffering doesn't exist, because the moment he created that world, then love wouldn't exist. But there is one bigger problem with all of this, and it pushes all of these arguments to the side. And that is simply that Alex has no objective basis to call anything good or bad. He cannot call suffering bad from his naturalistic worldview. He can only say that it exists. And Alex acknowledges this fact, and he says it here.
I would love to pull back a little bit.
Sure.
And ask you, what are your values kind of rooted in and grounded in? Where would we start with that?
So I'm an ethical emotivist, which is a form of ethical non-cognitivism. I don't think that ethical claims have truth value. So crucially, I'm not saying that suffering is morally wrong. Outside of the senses that I as an emotivist will just express an emotion towards it, that I don't like it. I'm not claiming that it's immoral, that it's objectively bad. What I'm claiming is that suffering is unexpected on theism. It's an internal critique, right?
So what Alex just admitted to there is something very, very interesting, that he cannot defend suffering and the existence of God from his naturalistic worldview. He has no tools in his tool belt to be able to do so because there is no objective value system in his worldview. There is no good and evil, in other words. So all he can say is suffering just exists. So what does Alex have to do? He just admitted it. He has to jump into the Christian worldview and to try to poke holes at it. But I can't help but notice that maybe you can try to figure out a way to poke holes in Christianity and the person that you're speaking to won't be able to respond to them in a meaningful way. But I just noticed that actually your worldview and your position is totally indefensible, that you have to borrow from Christianity to even make the argument that you're making in the first place. Does anybody see the problem with that? That if your worldview is so broken that you have to borrow from Christianity to even make this argument in the first place, then it could be that Christianity is a superior worldview. Which brings us to the final statement. My question to Alex, if I had the opportunity to sit in front of him, would just be this. If Christianity, let's say, has a better story than atheism when it comes to human suffering, as I hope he would agree it does, then why not believe that Christianity is true? Or at least, why not practice Christianity using that kind of Pascalian wager, that it's at least good for humanity, it's good for us to believe, so I choose to believe it. Now, true, this does not mean that it is true. It just means that it is a better story than anything the atheist or the skeptic has to say. This goes to Bertrand Russell, the famous skeptic, in his quote, where he said that what good person can sit at the bed of a dying child and talk about God? And to that I say, well, what atheist can offer any consolation whatsoever to the dying child? What do they say? Well, evolution didn't work well for you, sorry, buddy. Now, of course, they're not going to say that because no good person would. But the problem is that they have nothing to offer. They have no consolation that they can give them in an afterlife. They have no consolation that their suffering might have an actual redemptive good that they don't know or they can't see, and that can't necessarily be explained but can be believed. They have nothing to say to the hurting. They have nothing to say to the broken. The best that they can muster is, I'm sorry, but with a compassion that they can never explain. But the Christian has no problem doing that. So if the Christian has a far better story, and if it just might be true, historic Jesus and all, well then, I would just say it's time to believe it. All right, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and to check out our sponsors below. But also, if this show was meaningful to you in any way, we're giving away a free movie this month for becoming a member of Indie Thinker, and you don't want to miss it. So you can go get exclusives and perks by going to indiethinker.org/support. But most importantly, go with God. So you just got done watching a small excerpt of a much larger episode. You can find the link to that full episode down below in the description of this video. So you definitely want to check that out, because if you like that clip, you'll like the much larger episode. And while you're at it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and click that little bell to be notified when great new episodes of Indie Thinker come your way. Thanks for watching.